Okay, so today I want to do something a little different. Most of the time I try to explain what is happening right now, what the latest move was, what it means, who benefits, who loses. But today I want to make a prediction, and I do not make predictions lightly. I made one in 2024. Specifically, I said that the escalatory spiral between the United States and Iran had crossed a structural threshold, a point of no return, that made direct military confrontation not just possible but probable within 18 to 24 months. That prediction was based on three observable conditions that anyone with access to open-source intelligence could verify. The first was the collapse of back-channel diplomacy between Washington and Tehran, confirmed by the withdrawal of intermediary nations from shuttle negotiations. The second was the acceleration of Iranian uranium enrichment to levels beyond any plausible civilian justification, a technical fact reported by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The third was the repositioning of American naval assets into offensive configurations in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, configurations that, historically, have preceded kinetic operations in every major American military engagement since 1990. Every single one of those three conditions materialized exactly as the structural model predicted. The confrontation came. It came on schedule. And now I want to tell you how it ends. Not because I have a crystal ball, not because I have access to classified intelligence or secret sources, but because wars, like empires, follow structural patterns, patterns that do not change simply because the participants believe their situation is unique. Every country that goes to war believes its war is unprecedented. Every country that has ever believed that has been wrong. The patterns are visible to anyone willing to study them. The outcomes are predictable to anyone willing to accept what the patterns say. And today I want to walk you through what those patterns tell us about where this conflict is heading, step by step, using the same analytical framework that allowed me to see it coming in the first place. Before I lay out the prediction, I need to establish the framework, because without the framework, the prediction is just opinion dressed in confidence, and opinion is worthless regardless of how confidently it is delivered. What is not worthless is structural analysis, the disciplined study of how wars begin, how they escalate, how they reach their turning points, how they exhaust their participants, and how they ultimately end. This is a field of study as old as Thucydides, and its central finding has not changed in 2,500 years. Here is the first thing you need to understand. Wars between great powers and regional powers almost never end the way the great power expects them to end. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it directly contradicts everything the great power tells its citizens at the beginning of every such conflict. The great power enters the war believing that its technological superiority, its economic weight, its global alliance network, and the sheer scale of its military investment guarantee a favorable outcome. And in almost every documented case across the entire sweep of recorded history, that belief has proven to be catastrophically wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong. Wrong in ways that reshape the global order for generations. Let me take you back to the 5th century BC, to the war that literally invented the academic study of strategy. Athens, in the year 431 BC, was the greatest naval and commercial power in the ancient Mediterranean world. Its fleet was unmatched by any rival. Its treasury, replenished by tribute from the Delian League, was overflowing. Its alliance network spanned the Aegean Sea and gave Athens access to resources, manpower, trade routes, and strategic depth that no competitor could replicate. Athens was, by every measurable standard of the ancient world, the superpower. And in 431 BC, Athens went to war with Sparta. The Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years. 27 years of continuous conflict. Athens had every material advantage that mattered in ancient warfare. More money, more ships, more allies, more trade, more institutional sophistication. And Athens lost. Not because Sparta suddenly discovered some new technology, not because Sparta built a better navy. Athens lost because it could not sustain the financial, demographic, and psychological cost of extended conflict against an adversary whose strategic patience exceeded Athenian strategic capacity. The turning point was the Sicilian expedition in 415 BC, Athens' disastrous decision to open a second front by projecting power across the Mediterranean to attack Syracuse. That single campaign consumed over 40,000 Athenian soldiers, more than 200 warships, and the last reserves of Athenian political cohesion and public confidence. It was the largest expeditionary disaster in all of ancient history. And here is the critical lesson. It did not happen because Athens was weak. It happened precisely because Athens was powerful enough to believe it could sustain military commitments on multiple fronts across vast distances simultaneously. That belief was the seed of the catastrophe. Now move forward 23 centuries to the summer of 1914. The British Empire was the most powerful political entity on the face of the earth. The Royal Navy controlled every major sea lane from the English Channel to the Strait of Malacca to the Cape of Good Hope. The pound sterling was the undisputed global reserve currency. British colonies, protectorates, and dominions spanned 6 continents and governed approximately 400 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's population. London was not just a capital, London was the command center of the world. And Britain entered the First World War in August 1914 with absolute confidence that its industrial capacity, its financial reserves, its imperial manpower pool, and its naval supremacy would deliver victory within 12 months, 18 at the outside. The war lasted 4 years and 3 months. Britain won on the battlefield. Britain lost the empire. Let me say that again because it is the single most important sentence in this analysis. Britain won the war and lost the future. The financial cost of the conflict, approximately $800 billion adjusted to today's currency, shattered the treasury, forced Britain into permanent structural debt to the United States for the first time in its national history, killed nearly 1 million British soldiers, and triggered a cascading, irreversible loss of imperial authority that would see the largest empire in human history disintegrate within 3 decades of the armistice. The India that Britain had governed for 2 centuries demanded independence. The Middle Eastern mandates that Britain had carved from the Ottoman collapse became ungovernable. The dominions that had sent their sons to die in Flanders and Gallipoli demanded autonomy. The empire that entered the war in 1914 as the most powerful civilization on earth exited the war in 1918 as a debtor state living on borrowed time. The death certificate was not written until Suez in 1956, but the mortal wound was inflicted in the trenches of the Somme and Passchendaele. This pattern, the great power wins the immediate battle but loses the structural era, is not an anomaly. It is the single most consistent outcome in the entire history of asymmetric conflict between established empires and determined regional adversaries. It happened to Athens against Sparta. It happened to Britain in the Great War. It happened to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, where a 10-year occupation that was supposed to secure the Soviet Union's southern border instead consumed the last reserves of Soviet economic, institutional, and psychological capacity and contributed directly to the disintegration of the entire Soviet state within 24 months of the final withdrawal. And I am telling you today, based on the structural analysis of how this current confrontation between the United States and Iran is developing, that the same pattern is now in operation. The names have changed. The weapons have changed. The geography has shifted by several thousand miles. The structural pattern has not changed at all. Let me walk you through the mechanism in detail, because this is where rigorous analysis separates itself from casual speculation. The way this war ends is not determined by who has better weapons, better satellites, better targeting software, or better generals. It is determined by 3 structural factors: cost sustainability, alliance durability, and domestic legitimacy, that have predicted the outcome of every single major asymmetric conflict in modern history with a consistency that should terrify anyone in Washington who is paying attention. Factor 1 is cost sustainability. The United States is currently spending approximately $300 million per day, every single day, on operations directly related to this confrontation. That figure encompasses carrier strike group deployments and their enormous fuel and maintenance costs, continuous aerial refueling operations over the Arabian Sea, missile defense system activations across the Gulf states, around-the-clock intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance flights, cybersecurity operations, and logistical support for regional partners who cannot function without American protection. That daily cost translates to over $100 billion per year in direct operational expenditure, layered on top of a baseline annual defense budget that already exceeds $850 billion and a cumulative national debt that has surpassed $34 trillion. Now consider the other side. Iran's total annual military budget is approximately $25 billion. Its asymmetric warfare costs, the drone programs, the missile development pipeline, the logistical support for regional allies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen represent a fraction of that figure. The cost ratio between the two sides is approximately 40-1 in favor of the smaller power. That means Iran can sustain this confrontation for decades at a level of expenditure that barely registers on its national accounts. The United States cannot sustain it for years without either dramatic budget increases that the domestic political system will refuse to authorize or dramatic cuts to other national priorities that the population will refuse to accept. This is not speculation. This is the same arithmetic, the same structural cost asymmetry that exhausted the Soviet military budget in Afghanistan, that broke American public tolerance for Vietnam, and that bankrupted the British imperial treasury after 2 world wars. The empire that spends more per day always believes its wealth is unlimited. It never is. Wealth is finite, patience is finite, and the adversary that spends less always has more of both. Factor 2 is alliance durability. Every great power enters a distant conflict believing its alliance network is a permanent feature of the geopolitical landscape, as fixed and reliable as geography itself. Every great power discovers, somewhere in the grinding middle of the conflict, that alliances are transactional arrangements maintained only as long as each partner perceives the benefits of participation to exceed the risks. Saudi Arabia, which the American strategic class has treated as an unshakable pillar of Gulf security for over 70 years, has spent the past 3 years diversifying its security and economic relationships toward Beijing and Moscow with a speed and determination that would have been unthinkable before 2020. The kingdom joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It accepted Chinese diplomatic mediation to restore relations with Iran, a negotiation from which Washington was entirely excluded. It began pricing certain oil sales to China in yuan, cracking the foundation of the petrodollar system that has underpinned American financial hegemony since 1974. The United Arab Emirates has accelerated its commercial reconciliation with Iran through free trade zones and banking channels designed to function independently of American sanctions infrastructure. Turkey has repositioned itself publicly as a mediator between civilizations rather than a NATO outpost committed to Western strategic objectives. Qatar has maintained open and active diplomatic backchannels with Tehran throughout the entire period of escalation. These are not betrayals, they are hedges, rational calculations by sovereign states that the current arrangement may not survive the decade and that alternative partnerships need to be in place before the transition occurs. And hedging by allies is the second structural indicator visible in every historical case that a great power's position in a distant theater is eroding beneath the surface. When your allies begin to hedge, they are not planning for your victory. They are preparing for your departure. Factor 3 is domestic legitimacy, and this is the silent killer. The factor that no war planner models, no think tank publishes about honestly, and no president acknowledges until it is too late. Great powers do not lose wars because their armies are defeated in decisive battles. Great powers lose wars because their own populations stop believing the war is worth fighting, worth funding, worth sacrificing for. The American public's support for sustained military operations in the Middle East has declined steadily and without meaningful reversal for over 20 years. The generation that is now being asked to fund, staff, and politically sustain this latest commitment grew up watching 2 previous wars in the same region consume 2 decades and over $8 trillion while producing no discernible strategic improvement in American security, American prosperity, or American standing in the world. Their patience is not limited, it is gone. And populations whose patience has been exhausted do not sustain 20-year military commitments in distant theaters. They demand withdrawal. They vote for candidates who promise withdrawal. And withdrawal, within the structural pattern, is not defeat in any meaningful sense. Withdrawal is simply the mechanism by which the pattern completes its cycle. The great power retreats, the regional power consolidates, the alliance network reshuffles, and the world that existed before the conflict began is replaced, permanently and irreversibly, by a world the great power no longer controls. Now here is the part that will surprise you, and I want to frame this carefully because it is genuinely counterintuitive and will provoke strong reactions on both sides of the political spectrum. The United States may actually benefit from the outcome that looks, on the surface, like losing this confrontation. The structural result that appears to be defeat, withdrawal, reduced presence, acceptance of Iranian regional influence, may be the single event that saves the American system from a far worse fate in the coming decades. Here is why. The greatest threat to American civilization today is not Iran. It is not China. It is not Russia. It is not any external adversary. The greatest threat is internal. The systematic consumption of American productive capacity by a military-industrial system that has absorbed over $15 trillion in the last 2 decades, while domestic infrastructure has deteriorated, educational outcomes have fallen behind Asian competitors, healthcare costs have spiraled beyond the reach of ordinary working families, and industrial competitiveness has eroded against nations that invest their national wealth in factories, laboratories, and high-speed rail instead of aircraft carriers and foreign bases. If this confrontation ends in a negotiated withdrawal, if the cost becomes so visible and so undeniable that the American political system is forced to confront the structural unsustainability of permanent military deployment across the Middle East, then the withdrawal itself becomes the catalyst for the reallocation of resources that America desperately needs to remain a viable great power in the 21st century. The Soviet Union did not have this option when it withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. The internal rot had progressed too far. The British Empire did not have this option after Suez. The imperial framework was already hollow. America still has this option. The productive base still exists. The innovative capacity is still world-class. The institutional memory of what a thriving domestic economy looks like has not yet been fully erased. But the window is narrowing every year, with every $100 billion consumed by a strategic posture that produces no measurable return. So here is how this ends. These are structural predictions, grounded in the historical pattern, offered with appropriate humility. Prediction 1. The military confrontation will not produce a decisive battlefield outcome for either side. Iran's geography, its mountain ranges, its strategic depth of over 1,600 kilometers from border to border, its population of 88 million spread across a territory 3 times the size of France, makes successful ground invasion functionally impossible by any military force on Earth. And Iran's conventional military capability, while formidable in a defensive context, is not sufficient to project sustained offensive power beyond its immediate regional neighborhood. The conflict will settle into a prolonged, low-intensity equilibrium that costs the United States enormously more per day to maintain than it costs Iran to sustain. This equilibrium will persist for between 2 and 5 years before domestic political pressure in Washington forces a fundamental reassessment. Prediction 2. The diplomatic resolution, when it finally comes, will look like an American concession and will be described as defeat by every editorial board, every think tank, and every cable news analyst in the Western media ecosystem. But the concession will be structural, not strategic. The United States will accept a reduced military footprint in the Persian Gulf in exchange for negotiated guarantees on commercial shipping, nuclear limitations, and a regional security framework that includes Iranian participation rather than mandating Iranian exclusion. This will be framed as capitulation by commentators who measure national strength in carrier deployments. It is not capitulation. It is the same structural adjustment that Britain made after Suez in 1956, the painful but ultimately necessary recognition that the cost of maintaining a particular imperial commitment has permanently exceeded the benefit. Britain survived Suez. Britain remained a significant global power, but Britain was never again the dominant external force in the Middle East. And the adjustment, humiliating as it felt in the moment, freed resources that sustained British domestic prosperity and institutional stability for another generation. Prediction 3. The long-term beneficiary of this entire confrontation will not be Iran, although Iran will consolidate its position as the dominant regional power across the Persian Gulf and the wider Middle East. The long-term beneficiary will be China, which has spent the entire duration of this conflict systematically deepening its economic relationships with every nation in the region, securing energy supply contracts designed to outlast any military deployment, building port and rail infrastructure across Central Asia and the Gulf through the Belt and Road Initiative, and positioning itself as the great power that builds rather than the great power that bombs. China's grand strategy is not military confrontation. It is patient, architectural, and economic. While the United States and Iran exhaust each other in a confrontation that follows the oldest pattern in strategic history, China is quietly constructing the physical, financial, and institutional infrastructure that will define the next century of global commerce. The ancient Silk Road is being rebuilt, and it does not run through Washington. I might be wrong about the specific timeline. I acknowledge that freely. Structural analysis gives you patterns and probabilities, not dates and certainties. But the pattern itself, The great power overextends, the regional power endures, the alliances erode, the domestic public loses patience, the withdrawal begins, and the world reorganizes around the new reality. This pattern has repeated without meaningful exception across 25 centuries of documented strategic history. It repeated in Athens, it repeated in London, it repeated in Moscow. The question is not whether it will repeat in Washington. The structural evidence overwhelmingly suggests it will. The question is whether the people in positions of authority in Washington who can see this pattern, and some of them can see it very clearly, I assure you, whether those people possess the political courage to act on what they see before the pattern completes itself without their consent. History does not wait for courage. History does not extend deadlines for nations that are not ready. And the graveyard of empires is patient. It has always been patient. This is not prophecy. This is game theory and structural history applied to a situation that is not as new as it appears. Question it. Test it against the evidence. Think for yourself.